At 03:08 hours local time, the first Flamingo cruise missile struck the central steam generation plant at the Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat Petrochemical complex in Bashkortostan, 1,300 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The 1,150-kilogram warhead detonated against the primary boiler, a 30-ton steel pressure vessel operating at 540 degrees Celsius, producing superheated steam at 80 atmospheres of pressure. The vessel ruptured. A wall of steam and shrapnel blasted through the plant building, shearing pipes, collapsing catwalks, and throwing equipment across the facility floor. Within 4 seconds, the steam header feeding every processing unit across the entire complex began losing pressure. Temperature gauges in the crude distillation column, 800 meters to the west, started dropping. Heat exchangers in the petrochemical section to the east began cooling. And deep inside the digital process control system monitoring the complex from the central control room, the first cascade of alarm signals began flashing across the operator consoles. The complex was dying, and it did not yet know how fast, because this was not a strike on one processing unit. Ukraine had tried that last month, and Russia repaired the damage in 3 weeks. This was a strike on the invisible systems that kept the entire complex alive. The steam, the hydrogen, the control network, and the electrical power that 3 interconnected facilities shared like blood vessels in a single body. Cut the vessels, and the body dies. And the man who mapped those vessels was not a military strategist or an intelligence analyst. He was a 27-year-old chemical process engineer who had watched his own refinery burn on a telegram video and walked into an SBU office the next day, offering the only thing he had left: the knowledge of exactly how a petrochemical complex works, and exactly how to make one stop. His name was Myroslav Petrik. He was a former process optimization specialist who had spent 4 years at the Kremenchuk oil refinery in Poltava Oblast, one of Ukraine's largest refineries, before Russian cruise missiles destroyed it in June 2022. He understood how petrochemical complexes operated at the molecular level: the temperatures, the pressures, the chemical reactions, the catalytic processes, the interconnected utility systems that turned crude oil into dozens of products. After Kremenchuk burned, he joined the SBU's energy infrastructure targeting cell. His job was to study Russian refineries and petrochemical facilities, identify their critical vulnerabilities, and design strike plans that created maximum damage with minimum ordnance. After the first Ukrainian strike on Salavat damaged a diesel hydrotreater last month, Myroslav was asked to assess the impact. His conclusion was blunt: the strike was almost useless. The hydrotreater processed only 15% of the facility's output. The complex continued operating at reduced capacity, rerouted crude flow through remaining units, and Russian engineers restored the damaged equipment within 3 weeks. Myroslav understood why the strike failed. The targeting team had treated Salavat like a single refinery. It was not. Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat was actually 3 interconnected facilities operating as one integrated complex. The oil refinery section processed crude into gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and fuel oil. The petrochemical section converted intermediate products into polyethylene, polypropylene, butyl alcohols, and chemical products used in military manufacturing. The fertilizer section produced ammonia and urea, feeding the explosives precursor supply chain. The 3 sections were linked by internal pipelines, heat exchangers, and utility systems sharing steam, cooling water, hydrogen, and electrical power. This interconnection was the complex's greatest strength during normal operations. It was also its greatest vulnerability. If the right combination of shared utility systems was destroyed, the failure would cascade across all 3 sections simultaneously. The complex would not just lose one unit, it would lose the ability to function as an integrated system. Myroslav identified 4 nodes that everything depended on. First, the central steam generation plant. Superheated steam drove turbines, heated processing columns, and powered pumps across all 3 sections. Without steam, crude oil could not be distilled, chemical reactions could not reach operating temperature, and cooling systems lost their driving force. Second, the hydrogen generation unit. Hydrogen was essential for both the refinery section and the petrochemical section. One large hydrogen plant fed both through a shared pipeline network. Destroying it shut down every process requiring hydrogen, which included nearly every high-value product the complex produced. Third, the central control room. Salavat had been modernized with a centralized digital process control system. All 3 sections were monitored from one control center, Destroying it would trigger automatic emergency shutdown across all units because the safety interlocks were designed to halt operations if the control system lost connectivity. Fourth, the main electrical substation. The complex consumed enormous power for pumps, compressors, instrumentation, and safety systems. Without grid power, backup generators could maintain emergency lighting but not production. Myroslav calculated that hitting all four simultaneously would cause a cascading failure, shutting down the entire complex within minutes. But the critical insight was what happened after the shutdown. When a petrochemical complex of this scale goes cold, with products still inside the equipment, the chemicals solidify, polymerize, or crystallize inside pipes, reactors, and heat exchangers. Catalyst beds are poisoned by the thermal shock. Polymer residues harden inside reaction vessels and must be chiseled out by hand. A cold shutdown caused by explosive damage to the utility systems would take 3 to 6 months to reverse. He submitted his analysis to his cell commander, Major Valentina Koval. She hesitated. "Petric, we already hit Salavat. Command classified it as a success. Going back looks like we did not finish the job. The targeting directorate wants new targets, not repeat visits. Write up the 4-node analysis for the database and move on." Myroslav did not move on. Over 11 days, he built a dossier proving the first strike was a waste, and the second, done correctly, would create damage 10 times greater. He calculated the economic impact. Salavat's total annual output was valued at approximately $4 billion. A 3 to 6 month shutdown removed over $1.5 billion of production from the Russian economy. He mapped the reinforced defenses, 3 Pantsir S-1 systems, a Tor M2 battery, expanded Pol 21 jamming, and an S-300 PM battery at Sterlitamak 30 kilometers southeast. The defenses were heavier than the first strike, but they were positioned to protect the refinery section on the western side, the same section hit last time. The 4 utility nodes were spread across the central industrial zone between the sections, areas the Pantsir coverage did not fully reach. He submitted the dossier directly to the SBU Strategic Targeting Directorate, 72 pages. His cover note: the first strike hit a hydrotreater, and Russia repaired it in 3 weeks. This strike hits the 4 utility nodes that keep the entire complex alive. Steam, hydrogen, control, power. Hit all 4 and Salavat does not repair in 3 weeks. It does not repair in 3 months. A colonel called Myroslav 36 hours later. "You worked at Kremenchuk before the Russians destroyed it." Myroslav answered, "Yes, sir. I watched it burn on a telegram video. That is why I am here." The colonel paused. "Then you know what a refinery looks like when it dies." Myroslav answered, "I know what it looks like from the inside, sir, and I know where to hit it so it does not come back." The mission was approved. The attack package was designated Zamerzanya, the Ukrainian word for freezing. 18 Flamingo cruise missiles. The first wave of 10 targeted the 4 utility nodes, 3 for the steam plant, 2 for the hydrogen unit, 3 for the central control room, and 2 for the main electrical substation. The second wave of 8 targeted the crude distillation unit and the ethylene cracker, ensuring that even if some utility nodes survived, the most critical processing equipment was destroyed directly. No behemoth or Sitchin support. The 1,300-kilometer distance required the entire package to be Flamingos operating at near maximum range. 18 missiles, 4 nodes, 1 cascading shutdown. At 1700 hours, 18 Flamingos launched from concealed sites in Poltava Oblast and banked northeast. They dropped to 50 meters as they crossed into Russian airspace and began the long transit through the Volga-Urals corridor. The night was overcast with low clouds across the Ural foothills. The terrain provided intermittent radar masking as the missiles followed river valleys and forest corridors through the sparsely defended interior. At 23:42 hours, the Nebo surveillance radar in the Chelyabinsk region detected faint returns moving southwest at 550 kilometers per hour through the Ural foothills. The operator flagged the contact. Classification took 3 minutes. The engagement order was transmitted to the S-300 PM battery at Sterlitamak. The S-300 PM locked onto the formation at a range of 52 kilometers. 4 missiles launched. The first tracked a Flamingo crossing an open valley and destroyed it at 21 kilometers. The second lost its target behind a forested ridge. The third chased a missile into a river valley and detonated among water reflections without hitting anything. The fourth found its target and destroyed it cleanly. A second salvo launched. 1 kill. 2 missiles lost in the increasingly cluttered low-altitude environment of the Ural foothills. 1 missile tracked a Flamingo that jinked behind terrain at the last second and overshot. 8 missiles total. 3 kills. 15 Flamingos continued. At 0244 hours, the formation entered the expanded Pole 21 GPS jamming belt around the Salavat industrial zone. Satellite positioning on every Flamingo became unreliable, but the missiles switched to terrain-following radar and optical navigation, locking onto the Belaya River valley that ran directly past the complex. The river's distinctive curves and bridge crossings were preloaded into each missile's navigation memory. The Pole 21 curtain could deny GPS. It could not erase a river. At 0251 hours, the Tor M2 battery on the northern approach detected the incoming formation at 9 kilometers. 4 missiles launched. 1 Flamingo destroyed at 3 kilometers. 1 caught by a proximity detonation that damaged the tail but did not bring it down. 2 missiles lost when the targets dove to 20 meters and blended into the Belaya River's surface reflections. The Tor reloaded and fired 4 more. 1 kill, 1 near miss, 2 lost in ground clutter, 8 Tor missiles, 2 clean kills, 13 Flamingos continued. At 0256 hours, the 3 Pantsir S-1 systems opened fire. The Western Pantsir launched 2 missiles, 1 kill, 1 missed when the target banked behind the refinery's distillation column. The Southern Pantsir fired 2, 1 kill, 1 lost behind the Petrochemical section's pipe rack. The Eastern Pantsir launched 2, 1 hit, 1 detonated close, but did not destroy the target. All 3 systems switched to cannon fire. 5,000 rounds per minute per system created 3 curtains of tracer fire across the western, southern, and eastern approaches. But the Flamingos were approaching from the north, threading through the gap between the Tor's position and the Pantsir coverage. The utility nodes sat in the central industrial zone between the 3 sections, precisely where the Pantsir positions could not concentrate their fire without risking damage to the complex itself. 2 more Flamingos were caught by cannon fire from the eastern Pantsir as they crossed into its arc. But 8 Flamingos continued through the gaps and crossed the complex perimeter. Security guards fired AK-12 rifles and a vehicle-mounted cord machine gun from the main gate. At 550 kilometers per hour, the Flamingos crossed the central zone in under 3 seconds. At 0308 hours, the first wave struck the utility nodes. 3 Flamingos dove into the steam generation plant. The first hit the primary boiler, rupturing the pressure vessel and releasing superheated steam across the building. The second struck the secondary boiler. The third hit the steam header junction where the main distribution pipes branch toward the 3 sections. Within 4 seconds, steam pressure across the entire complex began dropping toward 0. Every process that depended on heat started cooling. 2 Flamingos struck the hydrogen generation unit simultaneously. The first hit the steam reformer where natural gas was converted to hydrogen. The second struck the hydrogen compressor and the distribution manifold feeding both the refinery and petrochemical sections. Hydrogen supply to every hydroprocessing and polymer synthesis unit was severed instantly. 3 Flamingos dove into the central control room building. The first punched through the roof and detonated inside the main monitoring hall where the digital process control servers, operator consoles, and safety interlock systems were housed. The second struck the adjacent server room containing the backup control systems and the historical data archive. The third hit the building's power distribution panel and communications room, severing every data link between the control center and the 300 process units it monitored across the complex. The automatic safety interlocks, detecting total loss of control connectivity, triggered emergency shutdown commands across all 3 sections simultaneously. Every valve began closing. Every pump began stopping. Every furnace began extinguishing. 1 Flamingo struck the main electrical substation. The transformer housing exploded. Grid power to the complex was severed. Backup generators activated, but could only sustain emergency lighting and fire suppression controls. Production power was gone. At 0311 hours, the cascading shutdown was already beyond recovery. Steam pressure had dropped to near 0. Hydrogen supply was cut. The control system was destroyed. Electrical power was severed. Across the complex, processing temperatures were falling rapidly. Crude oil in the distillation column was cooling and beginning to thicken. Polymer compounds in the ethylene cracker were solidifying against the reactor walls. Catalyst beds in the hydrocracker were experiencing thermal shock as temperatures plummeted. The entire complex was entering cold shutdown with product trapped inside every vessel, pipe, and heat exchanger. At 0314 hours, the second wave struck. 3 Flamingos dove into the crude distillation column. The first hit the column at its midsection, cracking the steel shell and releasing hydrocarbon vapor that ignited on contact with residual furnace heat. A fireball erupted from the fractured column, climbing 120 feet above the refinery. The second struck the column's reboiler at the base, destroying the heat source that had already been losing steam pressure. The third hit the atmospheric residue pump station, severing the flow path between the distillation column and the downstream processing units. 2 Flamingos struck the ethylene cracker in the petrochemical section. The first hit the thermal cracking furnace, destroying the radiant coils where hydrocarbon feedstock was heated to extreme temperatures to break molecular bonds. The second struck the quench system that rapidly cooled the cracked gases before they could recombine. Without the furnace and the quench, the ethylene cracker was dead. The final Flamingo struck the cooling water pump station that served all 3 sections. The pumps were destroyed, cutting the cooling water circulation that prevented process equipment from overheating. In a complex that was already cooling from shutdown, this seemed redundant, but Myroslav had planned it deliberately. When Russian engineers eventually attempted to restart the complex months later, they would need cooling water before they could bring any unit back to operating temperature. Without the pump station, even the restart would be delayed by additional weeks. By 0322 hours, Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat was in full cold shutdown. Every processing unit across all 3 sections had halted. The steam plant was destroyed. The hydrogen unit was wrecked. The control room was gutted. The power was severed. The distillation column was cracked and burning. The ethylene cracker was destroyed. Temperatures were falling across every vessel and pipeline in the complex. Product was solidifying inside equipment that was designed to never be allowed to cool. Russian emergency crews from Salavat and Sterlitamak arrived within 30 minutes. Fire crews deployed foam on the distillation column fire. Emergency generators were brought to the perimeter to power floodlights and safety systems. But there was nothing to restart. The utility systems that made the complex function as an integrated operation were gone. The fire in the distillation column burned for 14 hours. The damage assessment, completed 8 days later, confirmed the cascading failure Myroslav had predicted. The steam plant was destroyed, both primary boilers wrecked. The hydrogen unit was wrecked beyond repair. The control room was gutted with all process control servers and safety systems destroyed. The main substation was demolished. The distillation column was cracked, burned, and filled with solidified crude residue. The ethylene cracker furnace and quench system were destroyed. The cooling water pump station was wrecked, but the fertilizer section on the eastern campus survived with moderate damage. The ammonia synthesis unit had shut down automatically when steam pressure dropped, but its equipment was intact. If utility systems were rebuilt, the fertilizer section could resume production faster than the refinery or petrochemical sections. The restart timeline was devastating. The steam plant required complete reconstruction, 3 to 4 months. The hydrogen unit required new equipment, 2 to 3 months under sanctions. The control system required full replacement of servers, software, and safety interlocks, 4 to 5 months. The distillation column required repair or replacement plus cleaning of solidified crude, 4 to 6 months. The ethylene cracker required a new furnace and quench system, 5 to 8 months. And all work could only begin after utility systems were rebuilt, because every step required steam, hydrogen, power, and process control. Estimated total shutdown, 5 to 8 months for partial refinery restart, 6 to 10 months for the petrochemical section. Total production value lost, $2 to $3 billion. Russia lost 2.7% of its total refining capacity, significant polyethylene and chemical production feeding the military supply chain, and a major ammonia source for the explosives precursor pipeline. The first strike on Salavat last month damaged a hydrotreater, and Russia fixed it in 3 weeks. This strike killed the utility systems that kept the entire complex alive, and because the damage was not just explosive but thermodynamic, the solidified product inside every vessel and pipe would resist Russian engineers long after the fires were out. The strike did not destroy every refinery in Russia. It killed the one complex that was too interconnected to survive losing its own utility systems. And the chemical engineer who had watched his own refinery die on a telegram video made sure that when Salavat went cold, it would stay cold for months. In the SBU's energy infrastructure targeting cell, Myroslav Petrik's process flow diagram was still pinned to the wall, the 4 utility nodes circled in red marker with a single word beside each: steam, hydrogen, control, power. His name did not appear in any operational report. His Kremenchuk employment records were never mentioned. But the 72-page dossier that turned a chemical engineer's grief for his own destroyed workplace into the permanent shutdown of Russia's largest petrochemical complex sat in the classified archive, stamped with a note the reviewing colonel had written beneath the approval signature. He knows where it hurts.